Namaste and welcome, friends. I am really happy and excited to be joined today by Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams Sensei. And I want to introduce her and then we'll be talking. Um, Reverend Angel is an author, a maverick spiritual teacher, and founder of the Center for Transformation Change. And she's also, because we were just talking about it just a few moments ago, more recently crafted a meditation training program, which you'll hear more about, which is very juicy and dynamic. So Reverend Angel's the author of two books. The first is Being Black, Zen, and the Art of Living with Fearlessness and Grace and Radical Dharma. And the second is Radical Dharma, which is Talking Race, Love, and Liberation. And Radical Dharma is co-authored with Lama Rod Owens and Yasmin Saidullah. And it's a super high recommend.
Mhm.
I've read it and I've reread it, and it just shines this powerful, necessary light on truths that we don't often face, and yet only by facing can we heal. So it's super high recommend. And on a personal note, my own times with Reverend Angel, I just have been touched by her realness and huge caring and just her dedication to serving waking up. So, yeah, so with that, welcome, my friend. I'm so
Thank
glad to have
you.
you with us.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be with you and have to find ourselves back together again in
Yeah.
this place of, a kind of disparate, thrown apart and away from each other. So I feel really great gratitude for being here.
Yeah. Oh, good. Oh, good. Well, I'm going to jump in and I'm going to ask a number of my questions are kind of circling around the inspiration from Radical Dharma, just to begin as you, and this is a little bit biographical that you talk about entering a spiritual path as a leaving behind.
Mhm.
And as a young person, I'm just curious, what speak a little about what was going on in your life and the questions, the longings, and really how leaving behind is meaningful to all of us, that notion.
Yeah. Um, we are so shaped by our everything, right? By our culture, by time, by the era that we are born into, by the region, by the city. And so I was by race, by all of these other externally socially constructed and yet significantly impactful so-called identities, some of them chosen, some of them not chosen, and yet still we have to carry them because social, to be social is to be in a dynamic and mutual exchange. And so I was, young-ish, New York City, mixed race, but identified as Black and queer, and there's like a whole and I played basketball and there's like a whole set of things that were kind of became the expectation for how you rolled and how you showed up in the world and what you participated in and what you didn't participate in, and the language and clothing and fashion, like all of these things were the kind of apparent path that existed for me for what that identity was beginning to unfold, and I could see that path, and I was firmly on that path. My friends were of a certain type and certain ways. There were some ways that I resisted, and so I listened to Barbara Streisand and Broadway show tunes and ate stinky cheese and other things that my friends didn't didn't necessarily do. I ate snails and things as a result of the influence from my mom, who was always didn't finish didn't finish high school because I was born, but had a very worldly sense. So I had that, and then I found the copy of Zen Mind Beginner's Mind. It was actually first through art. I saw a Zen circle, which in some ways is just a circle, but for me, like hit me like a ton of bricks. It was like I could see everything in the nothing there, in the boldness and the simplicity. And as a result, I found the book now well known and beloved by Shunryu Suzuki Roshi, called Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. And as I read the book and as I felt, and I often reference, this sense of the Roberta Flack song, that someone was, strumming my pain with their fingers and singing my life with their words. And I felt that. And it was just like someone knew some deep thing about inside of me, about the ways that things didn't quite align, that the path that was there for me like wasn't quite true, but I didn't know something else. And they were illuminating not a path, but like that there was a possibility of something else. And that's probably the most curious and potent thing about this sense of home leaving. I didn't actually know where I was going. It wasn't like, okay, and now there's this other clear path. I just knew that there was something else for me that wasn't the path that seemed to be laid out, that I was, I participated in laying out for myself, but that I knew I had to go another way. And because the path that I was already on was home, it was how I understood myself, my identity. It required a home leaving in terms
Mm.
of so many things, in terms of Blackness and in terms of religion and spirituality and all of the things that were expected and prescribed and proscribed for me and by me. I had to leave them.
I think part of the reason it was powerful to read is that I think that's probably true for all of us on some level, that there's not one identity that we have,
Mm.
that on some level we don't have to leave, and then we can have it be in the mix, but it's not going to define us. And I think we just have to leave behind everyone on that level. And which really leads me to this next thing I wanted to ask you about, because you are known for teaching about a spiritual path that really includes all the dimensions of life, which means all the identities, all the ways we're relating, everything we're in relationship with, which is everything, you
Mm.
know. And that path by nature is an interweave of inner and societal transformation, that because it's an everything path, really. And so in Radical Dharma, I mean, part of the power of it is you point to the domains that we maybe even don't know that we're not leaving behind, that we haven't even examined. Uh, and I'll speak as a white person now, that are particularly uncomfortable and threatening for white people. We ignore them. Can you just speak to that a bit? Like, what are the domains we're not paying attention to?
Yeah, we are not paying attention to the domains, and I think that's for all of us, that we take for granted as a result of that shaping by society, that we inherit these identities, but we also inherit all of the systemic machinations of those identities, the expectations of those identities, including what we're entitled to, what we're not entitled to, what's potentially aspirational for us, and what we have an expectation of ourselves to be able to access and to be able to leverage, as well as the things, in the instance of people of color and anyone marginalized by a country and a society that has organized itself around a white supremacist ideological thinking. And I don't mean like KKK, but that white people are the embodiment and the epitome of the ideal of human society. And that's what we've been shaped as. And obviously that's not something that, if you happen to inherit a white body, that you want to say, yeah, I'm part of that. We want to believe, especially in a place that has been told us, we've been told that whatever we get is based on our own merits, that we earned it, that our families earned it, that what we have is because we had that coming to us. And if we, or by extension peoples, don't have things, it's because they didn't earn it, and they didn't deserve it, and they didn't work hard enough. And so blowing up that myth means we have to do some really deeply internal interrogation about what it means to have personal identities, personal paths, aspirations, and so on. And then also to look at and say, what is it of myself that I take for granted that is actually constructed and has already been preordained for me, that has already been, set up as an expectation, not because of my own effort and my own intentions and my own work and my own labor, but because of the identity that I have, the color of my skin, the gender that I have. And so that is pretty, that's an extraordinary ask to look beyond, not just the way that we see ourselves, but the way that society has already set something up for us, because it upends all of our beliefs about what we earned, what we're entitled to, what our country is up to, what it stands for, what it has, what how it came to be. And I think that that is very, difficult for people that have taken, conflated, uh, the culture that that I call whiteness and describe as whiteness, have conflated that for who you actually are. And so, for me, that was an obvious interrogation through the path of Dharma. Like it was like, yeah, of course, you're going to question like everything, like question everything. But if you're part of a dominant culture, one of the most extraordinary benefits is that you don't have to question everything. You can take some things for granted, and I think that that's what happens for, white-bodied people in this society, in this culture, in this era, in this time. And Radical Dharma is an invitation to not do something different. People have said like, oh, racial justice, it doesn't belong in the Dharma. I'm like, this is actually not about racial justice. This is actually about the Dharma. This is actually about doing what we set out to do, which is to interrogate everything.
So I'm with you, and it's remarkable to me that, you know, I started in, in the Dharma. Let's say I'm 68. I started in, 40 some years ago. And it really wasn't until 15 years ago that I got it, that if I can't, there's no waking up for what I call this body mind without facing the layers I haven't faced that are societal conditioning. But that I got away with that many decades not. And it wasn't that I didn't have a real love for truth and a love for love. And so what it makes me realize is that as a white person, we are so in the habit of being in our bubble that we're not exposed. So the suffering we're exposed to, and we might be really good at facing suffering, but
Mhm.
the suffering's on a personal level. And it's not our habit to feel an identification with a group that is, as a collective, been for centuries violating and oppressing another group. It's not our habit.
Mhm.
And
Well, it
so
doesn't
this is
serve us. It doesn't serve us to to identify that, because by design, the way in which the dichotomy between Black Africans peoples and white bodied people, white Europeans, has been by design, by the design of the legal structure and systems and so on. To look at that is to have to interrogate where you are, and so it serves us to not look at it, right? And that's the way the personal ego works, and it's also the way that the social ego works.
it totally makes sense. It's like the self is not at all interested in undoing the self.
Mhm.
And of course, it's totally, to the benefit of white people to maintain the system as it is, because we get privileged. And it's only until we in some way really register that continuing to not look causes us suffering too.
Mhm.
I mean, we have to actually feel the suffering. And you have a chapter, I mean, I loved a lot of the book, but there's a particular section that says, "Where's the love?"
Mm.
And it's a really powerful one because we all long to belong. We all long to belong to the whole. We want to belong to our inner life and each other. And most people I know really want to love, want to be loved, feel loving, and yet aren't looking at something that actually prevents us from truly having our heart free to love and feel belonging.
Mhm.
And maybe just to ask you to speak more to that, how come seeing these layers of truth that we're talking about and loving actually can't be separated?
Yeah. Well, first, I want to offer an intervention into the very, very well articulated idea that white people have privilege, and it's really an advantage, right? And I
Mm,
think and it's just, it could be just semantics, but those semantics make a big difference for people, because when we say privilege, we suggest that all of the things are, first of all, good and wanted by other people, right? Like, oh, I just want
mm,
those other privileges, which reifies the power dynamic of, like, white people are on top and they have the privileges, rather than they've been given advantage in a playing field,
mm,
that advantage is not did not come to them naturally, that it was actually handed to them by the structures, by the systems, by the invisible hand of inheritance, by the invisible hand of a culture that has the very strong intention to situate some people at the top of this game. And when I say at the top, I mean for material purposes,
mhm,
because that's also important. Is we talk about privileges, and we suggest basically that material access is the entirety of the game, and that's really what radical dharma is about. And we talk about, like, where is the love, is that if you have this whole conversation about what do we desire and what we need, and what advantages us, and what it is that we aspire to, and it's all situated in material resources, material access, then you immediately understand why we are left so un unwhole and unwholesome
mm,
in our pursuit of a more whole truth for ourselves, that our spiritual self, that our sense of life itself suffers, that our sense of love,
mm,
that our capacity for love, that our capacity for compassion is impacted, right? So it's not just that you don't get as nice a house, or a car, or go to the right schools, but that actually your capacity for
mhm, mhm,
compassion
mhm,
suffers as a
mhm,
result of maintaining, or being complicit, or hanging out in misinformation or disinformation around what has happened in society, and what has situated us in the locations, and the social locations that we have. If you understand that the whole of your path as a being that is invested in truth and love and wholeness, and the planet, then you know right away what great suffering you have has beset you by not having your capacity for love as free as and open as spacious as possible. We've told the story for a long time that the conversations about marginalized people, be they queer people, Black people, immigrants, and so on and so forth, that those conversations about how do we help those people, and that just fools
mm,
us and
mm,
reifies our location of
mhm,
some
mhm.
kind of safe bubble. And it's actually a genius mechanism that continues to keep us not questioning where we are and what we are losing. So if you're in a white body, what are you losing? If I'm in an able body, what am I losing by not being able to have a sensitivity and an awareness of what it means to not have the ability of sight or movement or sound or so on and so forth? That if I'm in a class privileged body, if I'm a class advantaged body, like, what do I lose by shunning or disappearing people that don't have access to class? Or what does it mean, even as a Black person, to have a lot of the entitlements of what it means to be an American, and have no awareness of what of the fact of that so much of even what I have advantages for as being American, as being a nationalized so-called citizen, what it means that those things were taken from peoples whose lands these were originally. That diminishes me, right?
Yeah.
That right when I recognize it, I'm like, oh, in your decades of not being aware and being in a white bubble, like I had my decades of cowboys and Indians, sure, but not really owning the fact that
Mm.
that so much of what I uh, am able to leverage and have advantage from is because it was stolen from someone else.
Yeah. And we have to really get it in our bodies in a way that our hearts actually, that we cry
Mhm.
because of it. And, it's clear when we look at, like, I think if we look back and we say, okay, can you imagine if you were living during the times when there was chattel slavery and you were watching a family being separated? Can you imagine watching that and not having your heart break, and to know that most people watched it and they didn't have their heart break, which means they were cut off.
That's right.
And yet, so it's easier to see that, but for some reason, we take it into present time, and there's so much that's the same, but in a different
Mhm.
form. It looks a
Mhm.
little more like it's, just, "Oh, there are these laws," but it's
Mhm.
humans being stepped on and Black bodies being afraid and Indigenous people being disenfranchised, powerless, and
Mhm.
still suffering hugely. And we don't look at what's current and
Mhm.
realize that that means our hearts are cut off, anything we're not willing to look at.
Mhm.
And just to share, and I'd like to get your input on it, my own process, because my big question is, how do we motivate to look more deeply? Because I very much believe that unless we look and face the suffering and the truth, that we don't widen the circles. And for me, I was in a mixed race group for 3 years where our sole inquiry is, what is it like being you? And a lot from the group perspective. And for the first 6 months of that, Reverend Angel, I was self conscious. I was kind of frozen. I was afraid of saying the wrong thing. I was just like a classic white person that just was so tense about, was I going to blow it? And when I did some inner processing, it became clear, the white fragility, white guilt, and that I was I was hearing the daily violations experienced by friends of mine, and rather than just feeling compassion, I was feeling bad about myself because I was part of the group that had been oppressing for centuries. So it
Mhm.
wasn't until I got under that and felt, first of all, how cut off that made me, like that longing to belong, and then out of that, this, like, wide open, letting my heart get that, the crushingness of the horror that's gone on. And I
Mhm.
had to, like, cry and cry and cry, and this has been repeated a number of times.
Mhm.
I mean, really heartbreak,
Mm.
until, I mean, it was a shift from guilt to heartbreak, but
Mhm.
then, oh my gosh, these are now life friends,
Mm.
and it wasn't like, okay, now that I'm not feeling guilty, I'm not gonna do something. It was like I felt more engaged and accountable, but that's kind of what it took, and I don't know, other than being kind of close in,
Mhm.
how we let ourselves kind of break open like that.
Mhm. Well, that's much of the work that has come from the book Radical Dharma has been to for me to noodle on that and say what is the conversation that we need to have? Like, how do we get people to feel that sense of motivation? To have the view, right? You can have the view, but what is the motivation to actually
Yeah.
do something about it? And for me, it really is this reframe of understanding that you have skin in the game, right? That the loss is to you. I have conversations with people that really explain, bit by bit, how, in fact, the laws that were set up were not intended mostly to, put African people down, but actually to control white-bodied people, right? To assure that white-bodied people would have exactly the experience that you talked about. And it's funny that you told that, because I tell that story, and it's something that I generated in the work of Radical Dharma, of what does it mean? That was my inquiry. What does it mean? I was in some southern place, and I was in a square that had been like a slave market, and I was standing there, and it was like a beautiful, like, we have like public squares. It was shaped in a circle, and they had markers in showing, where like this is where, enslaved peoples were sold, and and so on. And there was a little stand in this square of someone selling flowers, and I just got this whole imagery of a white woman with her baby,
Mm.
in her, stroller, whatever stroller thing that was there, a couple of extra, one with a hand, holding a hand, small children, baby, toddlers and bigger children, all in a kind of gathering and going around and getting, flowers and bread. And right there, you can see a Black woman with her baby having them being ripped apart from her hands. And so it was really not just people, but mother to mother, right? Mother to mother, the particular bond that mothers have with their children that I think was even more potent, right? Like at that time, because mothers were, expected to stay home with their children and so on. So mother to mother, that while your own children's hands are in your hand, that you see another mother. The only difference being that they have Black skin and you see them taken apart. I was just like, what could have that been? Like, what could have been going on in that person's body that could be tolerable, that they could tolerate that, and short of which, has been a concept that has been, floated, but short of being evil, that I had to believe that there had to been some systematic intervention into that woman's natural impulse as a human being to have care and to have compassion and to have connection, that there had to be some intervention into their natural innate human abilities for them to be able to tolerate that. And that was my inquiry that set me about on the work of Radical Dharma, is to try to unpack that. Had that woman understood, not just that she was ignoring what was happening in front of her, that her capacity for compassion was diminished as a result, that her capacity for care was diminished as a result. And contrary to popular belief, we're not nearly as compartmentalized as we believe. And so that reduced capacity for care and compassion is expressing itself somewhere else in her life, that as white-bodied people, as whatever people, as men, as whoever is being advantaged by these locations that require their disembodiment, that require the trading of their humanity for those advantages. For me, that is the conversation that I think is a motivation. And if you're not motivated by that, I don't know what you're going to be motivated by, honestly. Right? There's the power and the possibility of love, right, and connection that you have that is direct. But if you don't go and run out and go get some Black friends all of a sudden, I trust that the deep human heart to be liberated from a place in which we're cut off from care, in which we realize, like, oh, I am suffering. I am suffering that I can't see humanity and the suffering of humanity. That if that is not a motivation, then too much of your humanity has already been lost, and that you should go and get that, right? Not come and fix it for me or fix it for Black people or fix it for queer people, but that you fix it for yourself, that you regain what has been lost for yourself in your own humanity.
Well, I'm taking that one in. Um, it's still a quandary for me how it's possible that a whole society of people could have been and are cut off. I think it's happened elsewhere and through the ages, that people unreal other in a way that in some way does compartmentalize, turns, it's like from way back in the days when others were really a threat, to make them an other, less than human, have, the different names for others that made them less than human, allowed us to kill others. So there's something in that mechanism. Um, and it's just as you say, we don't, our hearts don't just open and close. When we're dissociated from our bodies, when we're not tender towards suffering in one place, it's a very limited tenderness towards others. So here's one of the things I
Well,
wonder.
what I wanted to say, and it's really important for people to understand this, is that we are in the place of discovering that, contrary to the lie that we've been sold, that we're just inclined towards this othering that then makes us aggressive, that we're actually inclined towards collaboration. We're inclined towards connection and compassion, and that, sure, our old brains look and scan for threat, and we see difference as potential threat. But as we have become more complex social creatures and live in more complex social realities, that actually we are, and that's why we have societies. That's why we have humane societies. That's why we have civilization, is because we are inclined towards collaboration and connection and compassion and working with each other, so that it is a function of the powers that would have us organize ourselves for gain, for those powers
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
subjects us to being able to subjugate our impulse for connection and care. That is something that through the ages is not just like, it's just not in us. It is our tribal leaders, it is our
Mhm.
governments, it is our presidents, it is our, right, that is actually something that is stoked, and it's communicated. And here's the really important point that many people don't get: it is under threat
Mhm.
to your belonging to that society, that you are commissioned to be complicit with that othering. So it's not just something that happens, to the other person. It is under threat. So if you don't participate, if you're not complicit, then you are threatened to be cast out. And that's deeply human, is that our need and our desire to continue to belong.
I'm with you. I mean, it feels like that is the evolutionary trajectory and hope of our evolved integrated brain and heart mind, is that our we have this capacity to hold hands, to realize who we are beyond a separate self, to realize our belonging. And it's the only way we might save the species or the earth, is if we nourish that. And it's that survival brain kicking in. And it does when there's spikes of fear. And right now around the planet, we are spiking. And the more fear, the more fundamentalism, and the more dividedness, and the more individualism. So it wasn't until, again, the last 15, 20 years that I really started registering that the word individualism, it's not, it's actually a sign of the toxicity of, it's part of capitalism, which I think is a force that keeps us not going to the collaborative, but being, it fosters the survival brain. And you call it hyper individualism. And I feel like it needs attention. And a lot of people that are with us here, a lot of people relate to Buddhism and are following and practicing Buddhist meditations, and often don't realize that in Buddhism, it's not about an individual self waking up. It's really about, and becoming enlightened. It's really about awakening to realize there isn't that separation, and that we're really awakening together. But in the West, when Buddhism came to the West, the way it got the Western converts, is very much an individual path. And I'm bringing this up, Reverend Angel, because I feel like for Western practitioners, it reinforces that bubble, and so we're getting better and better at attending to our individual suffering. I'm better and better at sensing your suffering, but there's not a sense of the collective and opening to that level. So I just wonder if, in a practical way, like in our daily life, how to see this, how to wake up from that self focus.
Yeah. Well, it's important to recognize that we extrapolated concepts and practices in a way that suited. When I say us, I want to say, white males, right, that were suited by extrapolating Buddhist concepts in this way. And so we can take anything and make it our part of our incarceration. We can take anything and kind of wrangle it around. And that was the germ for Radical Dharma as a book. I was like, wow, we have this profound, powerful teaching. that is exactly for that. That is about allowing us to dissolve this hyper individualism into an awareness of the great vastness and complexity and boundlessness of what it means to be a part of the entire sentient and insentient, unsentient family of all of life, and yet we've rendered it, we've interpreted it as something that reifies, not just a bubble, but a bubble, that it, in practice, it reifies hyper individualism in terms of the theory of the practice, but in practical spaces, in terms of sanghas and communities, it's actually reifying white supremacy.
Mhm.
It's actually keeping that intact, and using language, including like right speech, to keep people from talking about what is true and what they're seeing and what they're experiencing. And so distinguishing the waking up, whether it's an individual waking up or collective waking up, from the growing up, to actually face, the relative reality that we live in bodies every day, that we live with all of the expressions and impacts and truths of what it means to be in a white body, a Black body, a Latino body, a Asian body. Like, that's something that we have missed entirely in the Buddha Dharma, that we have been so leaning towards that hyper individualist, go for self, like let's go get the holy grail of enlightenment, that it has leaned us away from, which is a reinforcing story of just go across the country and kill everything that exists and take it all for ourselves. Can't we hear that? Can't we hear that we are taking the Dharma, this vast and profound teaching, and threading it through this tiny, tiny space of hyper individualism, winner takes all, go for self, climb the ladder of titles and positions and locations, that all it is just a little facet of the same story that has been the shaping of this society. And so I think that the pathway is for us to recognize that we do have to do the social education that is necessary for us to understand our relative reality, that the Dharma is not sufficient when you exist in the dominant paradigm, that because the story has been told and the narrative has been shaped through that paradigm, right? It's been like extruded through the paradigm of hyper individualism, of racialized capitalism. It's not just capitalism we have racialized capitalism, like racialized
Mhm.
capitalism of of winner take all, of the white heterosexual, Anglo-Saxon male Protestant as the epitome of everything, and where we want to keep moving towards, and that the Black female is what we want to move away from, that we have this dichotomy and this great binary of a spectrum that we're moving along and trying to get further and further away from, and what we lose is the wholeness of who we are as a human species, as a planetary species, as folks that should be stewards of the planet, instead are destroying it. Why? Because if we can destroy our sense of compassion and connection inside of ourselves with other human beings, then we just destroy our sense of compassion and connection to the planet itself, because those other beings are the planet itself. And so we're practicing that kind of behavior, and we're seeing the results of it in I would say, like, hyper technicolor, right? The impact
Yeah, yeah.
of hundreds of years of that destruction.
So I wonder, I mean, you're getting me kind of, there's a few different directions I kind of want to go in with this one. One is what you're saying. I'm very increasingly aware that there are caste systems in most places, that ours is one of the most violent and destructive examples here in the United States of a racial caste system. And that all hierarchies where there's subjugation and so on are part of the same challenge that we've got, that as long as that's ruling, if for those on top, they're there's no incentive to challenge it and look at it. So those of us practicing the Dharma that aren't being oppressed on that caste system don't have a reason to look at it. And we don't realize that just paying attention to our individual suffering will not free us, because there's a place that we keep holding ideas and stories that separate us. And so we're not aware of that. And you referred to meritocracy, which I think is just one of those most deep unseen
Mm,
elements, which is that in some way, when things go well for us, we deserved it. That
mhm,
if we're successful, if we're on top, if we've achieved something, it's because of our efforts and our deserving, and not realizing all the causes and conditions that even let us begin to move in that direction.
mhm,
um, and not even looking at that, not even looking at that. So here's what a larger question about hierarchy, and that is, I think a lot about speciesism, and that any hierarchy where there's any above and superior and not valuing life is part of the same dynamic. And I know many Black activists who are, you know, plant-based eating and so on, who agree. And I also know many who have a real objection to talking about speciesism as part of the same dynamic that you and I have been talking about thus far, because they feel like in some way that Black people or Muslim people or whoever's lower are being compared to non-human animals. So maybe just to invite you to speak to that, like how to bring in our human cruelty, and absolute, like, how can we watch an animal go through suffering and not feel? And isn't that the same cutoff on some level?
Yeah, well, I think that the objection is, so first of all, let's just name this as dominance, right? Like it's important to recognize that, the thing we call white supremacy and the paradigm that we exist, the ideological paradigm that we exist in is actually one of a, a human arc that leads towards dominance, where the only way that we understand our sense of safety is to dominate other
Mm,
beings,
mm,
other peoples, other so on. I think the complexity in terms of the correlation is that we have seen, as Black people, as peoples that are marginalized, is that we have seen white-bodied people in particular, so people that are located in dominant paradigms, use that as an excuse to then turn around and focus their attention. So now we'll go and we'll, save animals and so on, but we actually don't do the more complex work of what it means to be relational sociological creatures, right? And so I think that's it is the same, and um, the levels of choice that exist bet- between interspecies, right? Like we're intraspecies, when we are of one species, is important to acknowledge and to recognize that, like, you're actually doing this still to your own species, right? Like, and so there's even less of a distinction that we can claim that we are seeing. So some people may say, well, I need to eat meat in order to survive. My body doesn't
mhm, mm,
survive.
mm.
And so, maybe I'll offer prayers and blessings over the fact of this, and that, many indigenous, I've had conversations with, in First Nations peoples and indigenous peoples about that, about the recognition of that as a part of a cycle of life, right? That there are, and that you see that in nature, that there are some species that prey upon other species for the sake of their survival, and that ultimately it's in balance, and that doesn't exist in the for amongst the human species, that's not necessary other than for the purposes of material gain. And that's where we're back at the conversation of, to what end, to what end do we have this, our form of dominance? And so yes, it's happened throughout, time and history, and towards what end? And so if we are willing to see that the form of dominance that we have, through white supremacy, that the form of capitalism that we have, it is for the purposes of, nothing else than to maintain power and control. Then we're in a different conversation, rather than like, this is just what happens when human beings have fear of each other. Okay, so we can create like different locations and reservations and areas that we say, you have your line and I have my line. But actually what we're doing is we are making human beings resources. We are making animals resources. And so I think that the dividing line for me is not, or is not so much that are these different conversations, but what aspect of this conversation are we at? Are we talking about a survival conversation? Are we talking about a power conversation? Are we talking about this is something that is part of the cycle of life? And so as a result of that, yeah, there are people that eat meat. I'm not one of them, but there are people that eat meat and see that as part of something that's necessary. I've, as I said, I've really spoken to particularly a friend that is an Alaska native, and said, like, if he was going to survive on just plants, like, his people wouldn't survive. And then that's sort of becomes part of the culture. And maybe it's different for them now, but it's part of their culture and it's in balance. Versus, is this for the purpose of selfish, self-oriented accumulation of resources for no other reason than for greed and hatred and ignorance? And that is really what we talk about in the Dharma. And so we can see that there is a distinction between, whether one agrees with it or not, people that really believe that they're eating meat, or their use of animal products and so on as part of the cycle of life and for survival, versus this is so that I can accumulate and dominate and have control over people, and self-aggrandize and so on. And so I think that those are different conversations. Marginalized people are sensitive to it, because you will quickly get white folks that will be like, yeah, I want to go and save people in Africa, but I don't want to deal with the Black people that are right there in my own country, in my county, in my neighborhood, and see the suffering that is there. Tara, for me, the question is, are you willing to meet suffering, as it is, as you see it, and allow it to enter into your heart? And if you're not, that is your loss. That means that you have suffered a significant break in your own human development. And that it's not merely a social justice issue, that it is a human right issue. It's your right to be human. And if you're not willing to reclaim your own right to be human, to at least interrogate it, not for my sake, but for your own sake, that's something that you have to live with as an understanding. But I do think we have to educate people about what is being traded. I think we have to get people off of the idea that material resources, the material realm, is the only realm in which we are navigating our existence as a human species. And when we realize this, the great spiritual loss, the great loss of what it means to be a whole human being, in balance with all of creation, with all that exists. My deep, not only my belief, but my witness is that most human beings want to be free. They want to be, they want to have choice. And most of what we're involved in, I like to say, we have signed bad faith contracts. We didn't know what we were giving up in exchange for the resources, in exchange for the access. And some people do know, and they're comfortable with that. And that's not my business. Those people are not my business, but I don't think that that's the great masses of people. I think that most of the people that are listening to you, that are invested in the truth of their own heart, and seeking becoming more whole, and more sense of belonging to themselves, and belonging, and as a result of that, belonging to all of life, are inclined, when they hear and can receive that they are in a part of a system that is corrupt, that is complicit in great suffering, and that they have been engaged with it and involved with it, not by their own choice, that at the very least, they want to have choice.
Mm, mm, mm. You know what you're facing towards, I think, is where the hope is. And when you say, not everybody, but there are a substantial number of people, and it keeps evolving, that really care about freedom, about having that choice, and that when catch on to, oh, I'm cut off from my wholeness, get interested, get passionate, get dedicated to finding out. I think that is where the hope is. And maybe just if you have any other words about that, like what are you seeing? What are
Mhm.
you seeing now that's inspiring you, that gives some sense that this is our possibility?
What I see is, first of all, it's the great massive number of people. I share this idea about some people have been seduced into systems of domination. Some people have been induced, and
Mm,
that's the great number of people. And then, of course, there are people that are reduced by these systems. The number of people that are seduced, meaning that are overtly saying like, "Oh, I gained something. I know what it's costing. I know that I am." Part of danger and destruction of humanity. Like those people, you gotta like let them go because they know what they're in for, and we can't control human beings. But the vast number of people, by far, I would say that that's some kind of like very small percentage, 5% maybe, 5%. The vast number of people have been induced by all sorts of forms of inducement. Right from the beginning, you can't be a citizen if you don't separate yourself from Black people. You can't have
mm,
own
mm,
land if you
mm,
marry Black people. If you have your children will be subject to not being able to inherit the things that you worked for if your children are Black. Like this, so there have been systematic legal inductions into the participation with a system of domination of jobs and so on and so forth. Y'all go 1619 Project, go and check it out and like look up your history. And then of course the people that are reduced and left in a place in which they question their own sense of value and worth inside of that system, but all inside of both the inducement. What I have found, and people have been reduced, what I have found is that when people touch into it deeply and they realize that that the result of being in this place in which you're trading your own humanity is that you don't have a fundamental sense of belonging,
mm, mhm,
that you are always operating under threat, that if you do this wrong, that if you don't control these people, that if you don't keep climbing and getting ahead and getting this title or this location or like this entry into this school, that people feel the grind of that,
mhm, mm,
that if they don't if they want some ease in their life, right, that they're very belonging to their families, right,
mm,
to their clubs, to their churches, to their congregations, is under threat. And to realize that is to come to terms with the fact that your belonging is not guaranteed unless you are part of a system of suffering and a system of destruction. And to make the decision whether that is what you want to, how you want to continue to exist. I know most of us are exhausted and we feel that exhaustion. And that's why I worked on the audio program with Sounds True called Belonging,
mm, mm,
because what we have found is that so many of the people that are saying like, okay, well, let me question it, is they realize like, oh, it's not just that Black people are under threat or queer people are under threat, it's that I'm under threat,
mhm, mhm,
that this whole system has been set up to keep me in the grind, in the churning, in the fear that if I don't participate in this way, that if I relax, that I won't belong, that my location, that my wealth, that all the things that I have told myself or has been told to me that I earned for myself, that they will be taken away
mhm, mhm,
just like that. And that has been powerful motivation for people. And that's what I have seen. And so I don't think that the masses of people that we're seeing in race trainings, that we're seeing in conversations about what it means to be racialized, that we're seeing in Radical Dharma, I don't think that they suddenly went out and got a bunch of Black friends. I think that they saw that that they have skin in the game, that their own existence, that their own sense of belonging has been undermined and that they don't actually know who they are. And that as long as they're participating in this system blindly, that they will never know who they are, that they will never know their sense of a belonging that is fundamental, that goes beyond the material acquisitions and social location, and what that affords you and advantages you to. I think most people we want to know ourselves. We want to be whole.
So what I'm hearing from you, and there is a call to action, but the call to action really has to do with commit to questioning. Look, every day we're very committed to looking at, well, what's going on inside me right now and what might be going inside you, but also commit to questioning, what are we inside in terms of a societal sphere that just maintains a system that hurts others? Like, what are we inside? And it really, I can speak for myself, it has to be super intentional
Mhm.
because we get lulled really easily. I mean,
Really
that's the
easily.
power of the system. We get lulled. So, I
I
want to.
think the question is, who are you actually? I mean, for me, it's like, it's not just what's happening inside, but who are you? Do you know yourself separate from the idea of your racial identity and all of the advantages that are afforded to that racial identity? Do you know yourself separate from, a constant grind to try to get ahead and get on top? Do you know yourself? Do you know who you are when you are not subject to participating in a culture of dominance? That is the real question, is who are you, and do you know who you really are, and do you want to know? If you want to know, then you have to start asking those questions. And if you ask those questions, it will lead you to these other places. You don't have to suddenly have a great care or desire to be friendly with Black people, or fix their issues or social. That's great, and that's good for the polling boxes and so on. But if you're on a spiritual journey of being a whole human being, the question always has been, who are you? And can you get underneath that, into that inquiry beyond the social identities that you have been taking for granted? That is really the question. Can you get underneath the things that you've been taking for granted and ask yourself who you are beyond those social identities?
Beautiful. And I feel like that circles us in a very powerful way back to leaving behind, because if we can get under it, we can leave it behind and become who we really are in the wholeness of it. So bless you, dear. That's
Mhm,
wow. Yeah. I want to
mhm,
thank you, Reverend Angel. I want to thank all of you who are here listening. And just to say that if you want to engage more, find out more, Radical Dharma is a powerful tool for asking the who am I question and including all the social narratives that we might not be seeing.
mhm,
And also, Reverend Angel's crafted a meditation training program, and I know people in it. It's awesome. It's powerful. It's, as with everything, goes at all levels
mhm.
of who we are to wake up. And so I want to highly recommend that. You'll get the link from us. And again, a deep bow, my friend.
Yeah.
Pleasure
Yeah,
to be with you.
please connect with us, connect with the work, and really, Tara, I think one of the things I really want to say is that, because of the way that I entered the Dharma, that I took it to heart. I didn't have the entitlement to take some of the things for granted. And because I took it to heart, what became clear to me is that I had to ask all of the questions, all of the questions. And that's what made a difference for me, is the willingness to say, not I'm committed to, we have the bodhisattva vows and the liberation to save all beings. And honestly, altruism will only get you so far. But I was deeply committed to my own liberation. And so that's my inquiry and my invitation to every single person that is listening, to be so committed to your liberation that you're willing to see all of the things as they are.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.